Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us for the annual Michael Van Dusen lecture on the Middle East. We hear that the metro has some difficulties this morning, so for those of you who braved your way in, we are delighted to have you here, and the rest will probably trickle in. This lecture series honors Michael Van Dusen, the former Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Wilson Center. Since our inaugural lecture last year, the Middle East, as you know, has sunk deeper into turmoil and disarray. The phenomenon of ISIS, its rapid spread in a number of countries, and the atrocities its members commit have been particularly troubling. The question we all ask is, wherever did these people come from? Mike is himself a leading specialist on the Middle East, and it was his wish that we devote today's lecture to ISIS. On this topic, we naturally turn to our friend and also our former public policy scholar, the distinguished journalist and scholar Rami Khouri. Rami is based in Beirut. He's a syndicated columnist for the Daily Star of Lebanon. Most of you are familiar with his incisive and informative columns. Rami is also a former director of the Forest Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, where he is currently a senior public policy fellow. We have distributed a long bio of Rami, and for those of you who didn't pick it up, you can get it on your way out. Rami's intriguing topic for today's lecture is why ISIS is about the Arab past and not the Arab future. Rami, you can speak from there or here, and no.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Haleh, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and thank you all of you for coming, and especially thank you to Mike Van Dusen for making all this happen and for all the great work that he's done over the years. It's a double thrill for me to be here back at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I spent a few months as a fellow some years ago, but also to speak in honor of Mike Van Dusen and everything that he has done, and his achievements, his character, and mostly for what he represents in Washington. I've been in and out of Washington since I was a student at Syracuse University in the late 1960s, and I had the privilege of meeting him very early on in my years, coming here in the early 70s when he was in the House and the Foreign Affairs Committee. And what he represents is something that is quite erratic in Washington, which is accurate, relevant, timely knowledge about the modern Arab world and the wider Middle East, and a sensible set of analytical tools and policy prescriptions delivered in a style that is characterized by a combination of good common sense, civility, and taking the task at hand more seriously than he takes himself. And I think that's a very important combination that many of us can learn from, and certainly it has helped me in my career, and having known Mike and others like him. He's not the only one, but there's not a lot of people who bring that combination of assets to the Washington Middle East policymaking world, and knowing him and others like him here is one of the reasons why I've never given up completely on the possibility that a sensible realistic and equitable strain in Middle East policymaking in the United States might one day grow and help to shape more policies in the region by the United States government. And maybe we're seeing a little example of that going on in relations with Iran. So thank you, Mike, for all you've done and for the example you've set and for having me here today to share some thoughts with you. For the last 45 years or so, I've been living in the Middle East, living through all the events there since the early 1970s, observing, analyzing, and reporting on events in the Middle East. And I'd like to offer some comments today based on essentially what I've seen over these last 45 years, what I've experienced, and what I see as the combination of historically based experiences and realities that have ultimately now given us ISIS and may give us something else in the future. I'm talking about ISIS rather than the Islamic State, as they call themselves, because I think it's not appropriate to use the term Islamic State for many reasons. Mainly, I don't want to give them the sense of legitimacy that they might want by us using the name that they use, but mostly because I don't think they have the legitimacy of a state. And legitimacy derives first and foremost from one's own people, one's own citizens, and I don't think they have that. Ironically, it's this lack of legitimacy of ISIS that captures the main theme of my comments, which is that even though ISIS is dangerous, terrifying, maybe delusional in all of its many dimensions, it is not something that happened as a surprise. It could not have been directly and specifically predicted, but what happened was that it emerged, and it is the modern legacy of erratic Arab statehood and sovereignty, due to three main factors that have shaped the Middle East region and the Arab world in particular in recent generations. And those three broad factors are foreign military and imperial involvement in the region, which continues today with active foreign armies and drones and killings and wars taking place. Second one is the continuing conflict between Zionism and Arabism, which started as a Zionist-Palestinian conflict in the 30s and has then grown to be an Arab-Israeli conflict and now includes Iranian-Israeli tensions and wider afield. And that has been and continues to be, in my view, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the most radicalizing and destabilizing conflict in the Middle East. And thirdly, and most importantly, the brutal nature of Arab domestic state rule. Those three issues, foreign imperial military involvement, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and brutal Arab domestic state rule, those three have shaped the broad trends across the Middle East for the last, across the Arab world in particular, for the last 50, 60 years or so. And I say Arab state rule that was brutal. It was sometimes physically brutal in the way that state security authorities mistreated their citizens, tortured them, locked them up, killed them, simply because of the beliefs and thoughts that some of their citizens had. A process, a legacy which has now been translated to some citizens being thrown in jail for tweeting, and some citizens in some Gulf countries losing their citizenship simply for expressing views against the wishes of the government. But the Arab states' rule was always politically, intellectually, and culturally brutal for denying hundreds of millions of Arab nationals. We're not talking of a few thousand, we're talking of hundreds of millions. And there's 370 million Arabs today. So over the last 40, 50 years, we've got hundreds of millions of Arab nationals have been denied by their own governments the rights of citizenship in all of its dimensions, including free speech and association, an independent judiciary, political participation and accountability, and other things. So it's no surprise that we are discovering month after month recently more facts about the close relationships between ISIS and the former officers of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, which was one of the poster children of brutal Arab security-based family-run statehood. So the physical convergence between ISIS's leadership and the former Ba'athist security officials is now being documented much more clearly. And that relationship, I think, is not simply one of coincidence, but ISIS represents very much a reflection of the terrible things that Arab citizens had to endure for the last 3 generations. ISIS today is cruel, frightening, and dangerous, and the specter of its persistence as a state for years ahead is equally troubling. To deal with these 2 immense challenges of ISIS today and in the future, I suggest that we need to acknowledge that ISIS is mostly a tale of its and our past. To analyze it requires us to come to terms with what it represents in 3 dimensions, 3 broad geographical spheres and multiple sectoral dimensions. But let me first make 2 broad comments before I touch on those points. First, ISIS is a response to and a consequence of every major negative dimension of life in the modern Arab world for the past century. Every major negative dimension of life for the past century has ended up fueling the birth of ISIS and other movements like it, and fueling other things like people dying in their thousands trying to flee on boats to Europe, or getting into illicit drug trade and many other kinds of criminal and unethical activities. But ISIS is really the most dramatic and the most frightening dimension of this phenomenon, that all of the bad things that happened in the Arab world, military rule, Israeli colonization, American, British invasions, corruption, mismanagement, every bad, low educational standards, lack of jobs, every single bad thing that has happened in the Arab world has combined now to bring us ISIS. And many, many people are involved in this grim tale. It's not just Israelis and Americans and Arab regimes. You also have Russians and Saudis and Gulf people and Egyptians and military regimes and Iranians. And so everybody in the region, in the world, who's been involved in the Middle East has been involved in maintaining that old order that finally has started to fray at the edges and collapse in some areas. So ISIS is the living encapsulation of everything that has plagued us since World War I. It is the haunting ghost, the disfigured mirror, and the resurrected revenge of our century of autocratic and very often amateurish Arab statehood that is now fragmenting widely and collapsing in a few places. And this is a problem of distinctly Arab statehood. This is not about Islamic cultures or Middle Eastern statehood, because you have places like Iran, Israel, Turkey, other places around the Middle East that are not experiencing what is being experienced in Arab countries. So the problem is with the amateurish, brutal nature of Arab statehood above all. The second thing is that we should not be surprised that this movement has taken the form and mantle of an Islamic endeavor. Because ISIS, in my view, is at least the 7th manifestation of successive mass movements and political challenges to the Arab order that have taken place since around the 1930s and 1940s. With very few, if any, exceptions that prove the rule, only movements that marched under the banner of Islam have been able in the modern Arab world to generate significant popular support and to challenge or offer an alternative to the prevailing order in the region, whether that order is dominated by Arabs, or Israelis, Western powers, Iranians, Turks, whoever it may be. The 7 that I mentioned, I would say, are the original Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and its many offshoots, the militant Islamists like Jama'ah al-Islamiyya in the 1970s and 80s that adopted violence, which the Muslim Brotherhood broadly didn't historically, the Hamas and Hezbollah national resistance movements in Palestine and Lebanon, which are national resistance movements against Israeli occupation and colonization, and in their view also against Western predatory hegemonic goals, but that's how they present themselves, but they are predominantly these are national liberation, national resistance movements in Palestine and Lebanon. Then you had Al-Qaeda and Hizb al-Tahrir and assorted other similar takfiri offshoots and emulators to these kind of groups. You had Salafist Islamists in their many dimensions all across the region. And now we have ISIS, which is the 7th consecutive organization in a modern legacy of Arab political and social movements that challenged the status quo under the legitimizing and mobilizing power of Islam, because there was no other mechanism that could be used. There was no other political or cultural or social or business or ideological movement of any sort that was allowed to operate by Arab governments or that was able to harness popular support clandestinely. Only movements that drew on Islamic identity and promise had the power to operate on a large scale. So let me say a few words about the 3 dimensions of ISIS that I mentioned that we need to analyze in order to understand them properly, or understand that phenomenon properly, and hopefully one day defeat them. First, the dimensions of time. And there's 3 dimensions of time: the past, the present, and the future. Each reflects a different set of realities and concerns and opportunities. But the 3 are directly linked, because if we misdiagnose the past, we're going to make mistakes in addressing them in the present. If we make mistakes in addressing and countering ISIS in the present, it's going to lead to problems in the future. So the past, the present, and future are not distinct analytical categories, but part of an organic chain of cause and effect. And we need to, most of all, understand the many conditions and policies in the recent past, meaning the last 70, 80 years or so, the conditions and the policies of governments that allowed ISIS to be born and to grow and to consolidate and to expand. And only by understanding it and analyzing it accurately can we have any chance of containing it and then ultimately defeating it. So the past, ISIS came to be after nearly a century of many attempts by Arab men and women to enjoy the rights, privileges, and promises of citizenship in stable, satisfying modern states. ISIS is not the promise of citizenship in a stable state. ISIS is the negative consequence of 100 years of attempts by Arabs all over the world, all over the Arab world, to achieve citizenship and statehood and stability and normalcy. But those attempts failed collectively. They failed, and they were never able to break through to states that were both enjoying sustainable economic development, social justice, equity, and a political system that was seen to be effective and legitimate because it was shaped, defined, and most importantly, validated by its own people. We've never had that combination of assets in any Arab country. We have some rich Arab countries, we have some stable Arab countries, but we don't have any democratic Arab countries. We don't have any Arab countries where military authorities are subjected to civilian oversight. We don't have any Arab countries where national budgets, royal family budgets, presidential budgets are under the control of any kind of representative chamber. We don't have any kind of serious accountability or credible participation. And it's after a century of this, people in the Arab world rose up. In December 2010, we had this extraordinary set of revolutions and uprisings, which are still going on in many places. But you have to go back to the century since 1920 or so of attempts by people all over the region to have stable and satisfying statehood and citizenship. But these were there was a brief moment in the 30s and 40s when people started to have some breakthroughs in some Arab countries in terms of pluralistic, participatory political systems. But then these were hijacked by military and family rule across the region, starting really in the 1950s, and then going big time in the early 1970s when the dual factors of the humiliating defeat of the Arabs in 1967 by the hands of Israel and then the advent of massive oil funds in the early 70s that worked themselves around the region and essentially consolidated the police state, mukhabarat, security-run structures that came to be all over the region, in Syria and Iraq and Libya and Yemen and Sudan and other countries all over the region starting in the early 1970s. And so what had been often nationalistic and developmental states across the Arab world were replaced by family-run security states. Mismanagement and corruption proliferated. Citizens became consumers only. Populist political action was replaced by state-approved NGOs. By the mid-1980s, the oil-fueled economic boom and the developmental thrust that had actually taken place in the 50s and 60s could not keep pace with the population growth rates all across the region, which led, starting in the mid-1980s and continues today, to chronic stagnation in citizen well-being. And you can define this in any way you want: per capita income, access to social services, disparities between urban and rural, between rich and poor. And the most shocking aspect of this that I recently discovered when I was doing some research about education was that in many, many Arab countries, including some of the oil-rich Gulf countries, educational attainment levels at secondary school are pretty poor, and about 50% of kids in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades are barely able to read, virtually are not literate and numerate in their abilities. They cannot function as citizens in a thriving economy because they can barely read and do mathematics. We're talking about 40, 50, 60% levels of students who do not meet minimum educational standards in many countries all across the region. And this is not just rural Yemen and rural Morocco. We're talking about the major Arab countries, including some of the wealthy oil producers. And this is one of the consequences of the downward trend that we started experiencing in the 1970s. And therefore, what you had was a process since the early mid-80s until today of continual economic stress, stagnation, leading to unemployment among young people, marginalization, pauperization, fragmentation, vulnerability, in some cases humiliation among people who simply were not able to sufficiently take care of their own families in terms of food, housing, transportation, education, healthcare. And the historic Arab uprisings that took place in December 2010 were one glaring manifestation of the reaction that people had to this problem. And these uprisings captured all the sentiments and concerns and fears that people had, and they were calling for social justice, for dignity, for jobs. They weren't calling for democracy, they weren't calling for revenge, they weren't calling for power, they were calling for social justice, dignity, jobs, constitutional reform. So the past that is critically important for understanding the level and extent and depth of despair, and I use that term consciously, despair that many people had in the last 10, 15 years because they were not able to function as citizens in a pluralistic, accountable political system, nor were they able to meet their basic social and economic needs at the family level. And the terrifying thing about the Arab past is not only that it was so bad and painful for millions of people over 3 generations, and probably 15, 20% of the Arab people lived very comfortably, and people who were professionals, who were close to the regimes, who had access to the wealth that was flowing around the region. But maybe 20% of people in the Arab world had very good lives, but the overwhelming majority didn't. And it's not just that the majority had very difficult times politically and socioeconomically. It's that these trends continue today largely unchanged. and that the conditions of the past were widely supported by Western and other foreign powers, like Iran, Russia, China, United States, and others. That combination of things is what makes the past so frightening. Also significant is the role of Western and other powers who created conditions in the invasion of Iraq, the criminal invasion of Iraq in 2003, that created the environment of chaos in which ISIS and its predecessors could take root and grow following the arrival of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi there a few years after the 2003 war. And the chaos that was created in Iraq by the invasion created the environment in which a group like the Islamic State could start to set down roots and grow. And the important thing to keep in mind here about the past is that it was the combination of Western militarism and Arab autocracy that essentially gave birth to ISIS. Inadvertently, I'm not talking conspiracy theories, I'm talking inadvertently, the consequences of the policies of Western militarism and Arab autocrats created the conditions and the actors under which ISIS was able to take off, and Al-Qaeda. And what I mean by that is the Arab autocrats, it was essentially Arab jails, where people like Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi and Abdullah Azzam and many others were radicalized in Egyptian, Saudi, Jordanian, Syrian, Iraqi, Moroccan, any jail you want to choose. They were the radicalization of many of the actors who created Al-Qaeda and then ISIS happened in Arab jails, in Arab autocratic systems. And the conditions for them to grow came with Western militarism, whether the American invasion and not just American militarism, but also Russian militarism in Afghanistan way back for the birth of Al-Qaeda, but then the American invasion in the Middle East and the American military presence for the last 25 years. That combination of American jets and Arab jails was the critical fulcrum around which Qaeda and ISIS could actually germinate and take off. And the frightening thing again today is that American and Western militarism and Arab autocracy in jails continue virtually unchanged, that there has been no significant change in Arab political structures and no significant change in Western military involvement in the region. So that's about the past. The present, three important aspects of ISIS in the present, I think, need our attention. The first is that trying to counter ISIS by simplistic formula of social media messaging, appealing for moderate Islam to assert itself, or even convening White House gatherings to fight extremism, or Central Paris photo opportunities by well-meaning but clearly confused national leaders from the West and from the Middle East will not work. These approaches simply will not work because none of them gets anywhere close to the powerful fundamental driving forces across many sectors that created ISIS and continued to draw adherents to it. Second, trying to defeat ISIS with the same combination of actors that created it, my shorthand is Western jets and Arab jails, trying to defeat them with that combination will go down in modern history as among the most nonsensical, knuckle-headed attempts ever at conducting foreign policy. It's absolutely flabbergasting that you people assume that American militarism and Arab autocracy together can defeat ISIS when it was that combination that helped give it birth. The midwives of ISIS cannot be its pallbearers. There has to be a significant coming to terms with the reality of how Western militarism and Arab autocracy combine to conduct policy. Third, gathering together those forces in the Middle East that are required to contain and then to eliminate ISIS and other such movements requires credible and practical measures that would indicate to hundreds of millions of Arabs that the ways of the past are changing and that better days beckon for Arab citizens. Arabs themselves will defeat ISIS and prevent the birth of other groups like it only if they see tangible improvements in the areas that bedeviled them and tormented them in the past, in the exercise of power, their equal rights of citizenship in their own societies. Few, if any, signs of these changes are visible today. In most Arab countries, the trajectory in human rights, freedom of expression, meaningful political participation, and personal liberties is either totally stuck or in some cases, like I would mention Egypt and some of the Gulf countries, is moving backwards. Third, the future. The only thing I would say about the future is that if we collectively wish to defeat ISIS and prevent other movements like it from cropping up here and there, we must quickly and unambiguously acknowledge the mistakes of the past and the unimpressive policies of the present, which I mentioned above, and start to change them substantively and rapidly. There is every possibility that ISIS can consolidate itself in its current heartland and continue to gather adherents in other Arab countries for decades ahead. We can't rule that out. But this will happen if the Arab region persists in the mass radicalization of its citizens that we have witnessed in the last 20, 30 years, and that continues to drive events in the region. It's astounding to me when I run into people across the Arab world who are not supporters of ISIS, but who say something, well, maybe they'll achieve something that the Arab governments couldn't achieve. And of course, some people in Western Iraq would say, well, these guys are better than the Maliki government that used to torment us. And some people would say in places where they rule in other places, you hear reports of people saying, well, at least they brought order to the streets, and we have bread every day. So you have this extraordinary situation where Arab citizens, so bludgeoned by the brutality and the disparity and the terrible consequences of the policies of their own governments and foreign governments over the last 30, 40 years, would go so far as to say, well, you know, I'll put up with these guys, with ISIS, if they give us bread and if they keep order in the streets and they stop thieves from coming and stealing from our house and things of that nature. So what ISIS, again, over and over tells us is that they cannot be compared to any kind of sort of absolutist Islamic state or political rule or mass movement. They must be judged and assessed in relationship to the past of the citizens in the regions where ISIS now rules. Second thing is the geographic spheres. I'll just mention very quickly that there are basically three concentric circles that we have to look at. The first is the Arab Islamic Middle East, which is the heartland of ISIS and where it was born and where it continues to expand from. And you see pockets of people in Libya and in Yemen and in northern Sinai and a few other places saying that they are expressing allegiance to ISIS. These are very small groups of people, but the fact that they are popping up here and there is troubling. So the core problem is in the Arab heartland. The second circle is Islamic societies beyond the Middle East, in Asia and other places where disgruntled citizens, many of whom have suffered the same mistreatment as Arabs have, leave and come and join ISIS. And the third one, and most fascinating, but I think in the end least significant, is the thousands of people who come to ISIS from Western countries, mostly from Europe. And that raises a whole set of issues which really relates to the lives of these young Muslims in Western societies, in Western prisons, issues of assimilation, but also you have issues of social discontent and alienation, and a lot of people in Western countries just suddenly decide to convert to Islam and then go to Raqqa. So the phenomenon of Western citizens coming to join ISIS is one that needs a lot of analysis, but essentially is, I believe, is a sideshow to the real problem, which is the core discontent that has given birth to ISIS in the Arab world. And lastly, the sectoral dimensions. What are the issues that actually matter, that attract people to ISIS, and that are the issues that we must tackle in the present and the future. I'll just list them very quickly because people have written books on these issues. There is a small core of religiously inspired members of ISIS who take the religious dictates very seriously. Most Muslims in the world don't take these people seriously as religious actors, but there are small numbers who join the Islamic State because it gives meaning to their life, and it guides their personal and communal life, and they believe they're creating a perfect society in the image of what the Prophet wanted. There's also an active quest among religious members for the millenarian promise, the extreme idealism of a perfect society, and the coming of the Messiah and the Mahdi and the end of the world. And this is an obligation that some very devout people see, but these are very, very small numbers of people. Third, there's a religious dimension in some sense among activists who join ISIS, that they're involved in a jihad to protect Islamic society from foreign threats. Or from Muslim leaders who are not very good Muslims. You have the sectarian problem, which has now emerged and never really existed in any serious way in the modern Arab world, but only really came into being after 2003 in Iraq. And you have a lot of people who are joining ISIS because they see it as the way to protect the last stronghold of Sunni governance and rule, and they are afraid of Shiite dominance or Iranian dominance or the rule of other Sunnis who are very powerful and who threaten them. So the sectarian issue has become a real problem now, and is not easily put back into the bottle, but must be. There are issues of identity, people who join ISIS because it helps them understand their place in the world. It gives meaning to their life. It gives purpose to their life. There are issues of citizenship. People who join ISIS feel that they are part of a citizenry and they have certain rights if they play by those rules. There are issues of governance that ISIS tells us a lot about. ISIS came to being, I said, because of misgovernment across the Arab world for 3 generations. But there are many people who join ISIS because they feel that there's a set of rules that govern how daily life works, and including a judicial adjudication of disputes and things. ISIS is a solution for many for the politics of collective disenfranchisement and resentment, who are just fed up with life in the Arab world, and they want to go somewhere where they feel that as Muslims they can be in a society where they actually are part of the society and help run the society. There's historical revenge and redemption for some people who join ISIS because they're angry about what happened in the past, especially at the hand of colonial autocrats or Israelis or others in the region. There's some people who join ISIS simply to get $400 a month as a job. You have some people who join ISIS, especially from the Western world, because it's jihadi cool. They ride around in a motorcycle or in a pickup truck with a machine gun, and it gives them a sense of adventure and power and something to do. There are people who join ISIS because of the social norms that it offers them, that there's proper roles for men and women and children and elderly people and others, and there's a social structure that explains how life works. There's people who join ISIS because it allows them to get the basic human needs that they don't otherwise get, housing, electricity, jobs. Many people join ISIS because it brings order and justice to a society that was unruly and disorderly and full of crime. And then you have the issue of social media and communications as a tool to bring all this about, to the point where I was surprised yesterday when I read in the newspaper arriving in Washington that I think it was the FBI director who said something like the United States is unable to keep up with all of the potential people in the United States who are being recruited by ISIS. So this wide range of issues, and I just mentioned them quickly because there's just an enormous amount of reasons why people would give up on the order of the societies they live in and join a group like ISIS, which is such a criminal, dangerous group and continues to grow in certain areas. I believe ISIS can be easily defeated when you get the combination of local Arab governments and armies militias supported by Iran or anybody else in the Arab countries, Kurdish troops, local uprising troops in Iraq and Syria, and Western and other Arab armies all fighting together to defeat ISIS, they will be defeated very quickly. But if we defeat them very quickly, and all the underlying causes that gave birth to them are still there, or, as I said, in some cases are getting worse, then there'll be worse things than ISIS. We will then look for the 8th iteration of some kind of mass movement that wants to challenge and change the prevailing order, because that prevailing order is dehumanizing and humiliating to hundreds of millions of people in the Arab world who graduate from school barely able to read and write in about 50% of cases, who can't possibly get a reasonable job. And 65% of new entrants to the labor market in Egypt today go into the informal sector. They sweep streets, they clean shoes, they clean car windows. That's the only thing they can do. They're destined to a life of poverty and misery. 1.5 million Egyptians are born every year. There's been 6 million new Egyptians since the uprising started, 6.5 million new Egyptians. They all have to be fed and schooled and given jobs in the future. There's no way that the prevailing Arab order can achieve these things, and therefore, unless these underlying issues of governance, of power, of authority, and of citizenship are addressed, we will be dealing with the ISIS phenomenon for years and years. And that's why, in conclusion, I say ISIS tells us what the problems are in our Arab world now and what they have been for the last 50, 60 years. Addressing them is really hard. Every attempt by local people and Westerners to promote democracy and pluralism and accountability has failed. None of them have worked very well. The only serious attempt was the uprisings of 2010, one of which has succeeded so far in Tunisia. Across the rest of the region, it hasn't. Therefore, ISIS is a wake-up call, but it's a wake-up call about how we use power and how we govern our societies rather than anything about Islamic extremism or religious fundamentalism or anything like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rami. We have 15 minutes for questions. Yes, please. Can you please wait for the mic and identify?
I'm Paul Sham. I teach at the University of Maryland. Thank you, Haleh. Good to see you, Rami. As a historian, I'm very pleased, and I certainly agree with your diagnoses of where ISIS came from. I wonder if you would give some hints as to how Western societies can even conceptualize dealing with it, given that it's seen as such a Hobson's choice between radical Sunnis and radical Shia, supported by Iran and Hezbollah. Your a larger point of so I wonder if you have some policy ideas in the short and medium run that take account of political realities also.
The quick answer is I don't have any specific policy recommendations because I don't think anybody knows how Western countries or foreign countries in general, or the UN system, for instance, or international NGOs who have tried, how anybody from outside the Arab world can engage in the Arab world to promote the kind of political changes that we all need, which are absolutely essential to pulling the groundwork, pulling the rug out from under ISIS. But I think the thing to do is to, first of all, recognize that every Western attempt to promote democratic change in the Arab world has been unsuccessful. It just hasn't worked. So I would stop trying to promote democracy and judicial independence and free press and things like that with Western programs, because they don't work at all. I think the best opportunity is to identify those elements, those forces and groups inside the Arab world who are already working from within to change their societies and see how they might be supported, to see what they want. Change is going to happen from inside, as we saw from Tunisia. When external forces get involved, especially militarily, it only creates chaos and problems, which opens the door to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as we saw in Libya, as we're seeing in Syria, and as we're seeing now in Yemen. Qaeda has expanded quite a bit in the last 6 weeks because of the war there, and this will continue. So there is no clear policy prescription about how to promote development, pluralism, democratic change in the Arab world. This will come out of the Arab world itself, and the people of the region will be the ones that will have to figure out how to do it. There are two areas that I would say can be addressed by the West. One is to help bring about an Arab-Israeli peace that is fair and just and according to UN standards, UN resolutions. And the second one is to address the Iranian issue, which is being done now, I think, to get that issue off the table and to allow the region to develop economically. And the region itself, the Turks, the Iranians, the Saudis, the others, the Arabs, the Egyptians, will all together find a new security architecture for the region. And if the Arab-Israeli conflict is resolved, the Israelis in the future can join that too, but right now it's not possible.
I very much agree with your good analysis of the past and the present of the Arab world and what we may have to do with it. What scares the hell out of me is that much of what you said about the Arab world is true of Central Africa too. Are we going to get a new African ISIS that we have to add to the Arab ISIS to fight?
Well, I can't really speak about the African world, but in North Africa and the Arab parts of northern Africa, you see similar conditions happening. So what I'm talking about is applies to the entire Arab world. There are really no exceptions. You see, even in some of the rich Gulf states, in Lebanon and Jordan and North Africa, everywhere you see discontent eventually leads to a reaction, and the worst reaction is the ISIS kind of reaction.
Thank you. Zai Farsakh from the Project on Middle East Democracy. Thank you very much for the analysis. I also agree with it. I think the critical question here is knowing the way politics works in democracies where unfortunately short-term gains and interests are often precede more long-term objectives. How do you deal with such a situation where these are not new problems? We had the same problem with Vietnam and other in Cold War mistakes. So it's the same. You're asking the same politicians to behave differently, and they haven't for the last 50 or 100 years. So what needs to change? Where should we put pressure, or how should we engage the actual politics that's in the West so that they change their policies? Because arguably, they're not changing their policies because they have certain short-term interests that they're, whether it's oil or other things that they're looking at, and that's I think where we need to that's the key.
If I understood, what are the short-term issues that the West can be involved with to bring about change? I don't think there's much that can actually be done there. I mean, again, I'm looking back over the last half a century or so, of which I've experienced 45 years, and I've been sitting there in Jordan and Syria and Palestine and Lebanon, watching these groups come from the West, governments, UN, NGOs, well-intentioned, doing things that I've been trying to fight for my whole life as an Arab citizen, democracy and pluralism, etc., and accountability. It just cannot be done by foreign money and foreign support. The problem historically was that the Western powers were supporting the Arab autocrats, the leaders, and then at the same time trying to promote democracy at the grassroots. And we would often tell people who used to come to us saying, we want to work with you on a project to train young Arabs to do, election work or free media or something. And I would tell them, look, you have to decide. You either support Hosni Mubarak or you support the activists. You can't support the jailer and the prisoner at the same time. You have to choose whose side are you on. So what I would say, the thing that is most useful is for people who want to help promote positive change in the Arab world is to identify those many, many groups that are working at the grassroots level and trying to achieve change. They may not be doing political work, they may be doing education, they may be doing environmental work, they may be doing other important things, but work that allows Arabs to feel that they have a role to play in their society and can make their lives better, and to help support ongoing activities in the region rather than trying to come and create new ones. So I don't look at the Western world at all as a source of hope for democratic change in the region. And when we saw the uprisings, we immediately saw the United States the first 2-3 weeks they were kind of humming and hawing about Mubarak, and they weren't quite sure whose side to support. So I think the change has to come from within the region, and hopefully it'll be orderly, it'll be peaceful, it'll be democratic, participatory, etc.
Yes, please.
Gamal El-Masri, I'm from Egypt. I have a question regarding the money involved. Could you please speak a little bit about how all of a sudden the burst of ISIS came to being, and what the role, let's say, potentially is of Arab Gulf money in this, and whether there are any contradictions of supporting, let's say, anti-Assad forces in Syria, and then possibly expecting them to stay there and not come back and attack Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or other countries in the Gulf. Thank you.
Well, there was a lot of reports. There's a lot of things about ISIS that we just don't know. They're very secretive and they're very closed in on themselves. And there's been many, many reports over the last 2 years or so of money from the Gulf, particularly helping ISIS and helping Jabhat al-Nusra and others like them. Documentation and proof of this is still pretty much lacking as far as I can tell. But clearly there is something, they're getting money from sources around the region. I don't know I doubt it's Arab governments, but it's probably private money that Arab governments wink at. And clearly there are contradictions, absolutely. There are massive contradictions. If you look at Gulf GCC policies, some of the GCC support the rebels in Syria, but because they want to weaken Iran, we know that. But in weakening Iran, you're creating this new monster that is going to come back and bite you, just as the United States did when it helped support Qaeda against the Russians, and then Qaeda came back and bit the United States. So these kinds of policies, I think, teach us one thing, that military actions to try to bring about change in other people's countries don't work very well. We saw it in Libya, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in many places around the region, and we're still seeing it now with ISIS. These are issues that are political issues that need a political resolution. So the money that ISIS has comes from multiple sources. Right now, they seem to be much, much tighter on money because their oil income has been cut, and their trade, taxation and other things have been cut, and their needs are bigger. They have to fund many more fighters and social services. So they obviously need more income, and where they're going to get it from, through ransom money or other things, we don't know. ISIS is not a long-term phenomenon. I don't see it as sticking around for a long time. I think it will be defeated. The problem is what other expressions of discontent will come in its place. This is what scares me. So this need to push for serious economic and political and social reform in the Arab world is absolutely the number one priority. It's nothing new. We've been talking about this for the last 30, 40 years. But now, for the first time, people finally see the actual consequences of that. So I think when people now talk about the need to bring about political reform and citizenship rights, people will take it more seriously. When we were talking about this in the 70s and 80s, people were, nobody paid attention. But so this is the consequence of not paying attention to these underlying issues.
Did you have Yes, in the back, please.
Jim Fippard, American Tunisian Association.
Can you
I can't
speak
hear.
a little bit louder? We can't hear you in the front.
Yeah, just bring the mic closer to your mouth.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
You got that?
Yeah.
All right. Jim Fippard with the American Tunisian Association. My question is, I've been reading that the Saudis and the Gulf states are unhappy with the U.S. because of lack of military, providing military assistance to them in strengthening them against ISIS. Based on what you have said, and I agree with it, one would have to conclude that it's probably not a good idea for the U.S. to do that. But I'd like your comment on that.
Not a good idea to do what?
To provide military assistance to the Saudis and the Gulf states for attacking on ISIS.
Well, I think the U.S. providing military equipment to sovereign Arab countries is a perfectly legitimate thing to do if those Arab governments who use that military hardware do so in a mechanism that actually is supported by the people of those countries. The problem is when you give tens of billions of dollars of arms to Arab governments, and there's no link between the government and its citizens, and the governments go off and decide to do wars or to support an overthrow process in another country or to do whatever they're doing or use the arms against their own people, that's the problem. So I think legitimately the U.S. can and does, and the French now are cashing in on selling jet fighters to the Gulf. It's not the fact of getting arms from the U.S., it's the manner in which military actions are being used to try to resolve a problem that has no military solution. And that means ISIS, and it also means Yemen, and it means the Israeli attempt to use military against the Arab countries and the Palestinians and others. That you can't solve political problems through military means. We should have learned that by now. And I think the lesson of all this is to find a political process and social and economic development process that parallels the military track against ISIS and in other areas.
Rami, let me ask you one question. The history of ISIS has been atrocities, cruelty, violating every possible human rights, ethnic cleansing against both the Yazidis, the Shiite, whatever. What sort of an appeal have they for the ordinary people in the Arab world who are longing for exactly what you say, to join them? Because what they have proven on the ground is exactly the opposite of what these people want.
Right.
So, and on top of everything else, even Sunni Muslims are somehow feel a sense of they are shocked by what they see.
Absolutely. I don't want you to think that I'm saying that ISIS offers the aspirations that Arabs have been trying to achieve for 100 years. I'm saying it's because the hundreds of millions of Arabs have not been able to achieve their aspirations for normalcy and democracy and sustainable development, and they have not been able to achieve those things mainly because of the policies of their own governments as well as some international issues, that some people have become so fearful, so distorted, so dehumanized, that they've even turned to ISIS in some cases to say, well, maybe these guys will do it better. So I don't. The vast majority of people in the Arab world think ISIS are criminals, and they want to fight them. But what I'm saying is that we should and will fight them and defeat them. But if the underlying drivers that gave birth to them are not addressed, something more terrible is going to follow in the future. Maybe small groups of people who don't go around trying to create a state, but maybe who just go and try to use, say, chemical weapons or some terrible other means of mass disruption of society. So, but there are some people who have been so deranged by their mistreatment by their own societies in the Arab world that they'll even say, well, let ISIS come in those areas only, right? Nobody's calling for ISIS to come in and rule them, but in the areas where ISIS took over, a lot of people didn't put up resistance. And they could have, because they went in with a few hundred troops here and there. It's not like ISIS has thousands and thousands of, armored vehicles and things. The conquest that ISIS carries out is done by hundreds of people here and there. They could easily be confronted but the state of the mental political attitude of people in the Arab countries has been so deranged, so distorted by their modern history that they'll even just acquiesce in ISIS coming in because it means there's order and there's food and there's this. But then eventually they'll rise up against them, absolutely.
Marina, and then Mike.
Thank you. Rami, you said, people, essentially, if I can paraphrase what you said, people read into ISIS what they want to read. They read a hope for a better society, for a solution to these problems. Do you see any other ideas, any ideologies that are beginning to compete with these religious ideologies? Because in the Arab world, certainly in the past, there was a very powerful ideology that that represented this aspiration for a better future, and that was Nasserism, which was, in terms of what it delivered, it did not deliver what it promised, but it was certainly a very important ideology. Do you see anything coming up now?
Well, we saw in the uprisings a clear, overwhelming manifestation by millions and millions of Arabs to transform societies into something better. The problem with the uprisings is they were so spontaneous that there was no clear strategy about what people wanted. And the transitions were mismanaged, and therefore we are where we are. Only the Tunisians have broken through. But if you look around the region, there are clearly demands for democratic, participatory, pluralistic government. How to make that happen is something every country is going to have to learn on its own. The other two main sentiments that still exist out there is a sense of sort of Arabism among many people, but it's just an emotion rather than an ideology. And there is the other one is tribalism. The tribal sentiments are very strong in some countries like Jordan, like some countries like Kuwait, like Syria, Iraq, where tribal, Saudi Arabia, where tribal realities are still real. But those are not ideologies. Those are just identities. So in terms of an ideology that can counter ISIS, there isn't one and that's why when people demonstrated in the uprisings, they didn't have a slogan other than dignity, social justice, and a job. And food, al-khubz, al-adala, all these things. So and the reason there isn't anything out there is because there has been no opportunity for ordinary citizens to work collectively to define what they want to do. And this is the great price, the great tragedy that we're paying, that in our moment of greatest need for an ideology of transformation in the Arab world, there aren't any that are out there visible because none of the people were allowed to create them because of the autocratic political systems that what we suffered under. So this process of transformation and change is not going to be easy. It's going to take decades and decades, but it will happen because the Arab societies have very strong mechanisms of transformational providing comfort and support in a transformational process. The families, tribal groups, religious sentiment, local community organizations. So you have countries where things collapse, the government collapses, but society doesn't collapse. Society has mechanisms of orderly change and transformation, but it's going to take a long time for new ideologies to emerge, and there will not be any one ideology across the region. Each country will have its own version of what it wants to do, but the only ideology that will work in the final analysis is the consent of the governed. And until that happens, the Arab world will continue to be subjected to a lot of disorder. And if the Arab-Israeli conflict is not resolved, there will also be ripples from that as well.
Mike, you have the last word. You can come up.
I just want to say three very quick things. First of all, thanks to all of you for coming. And secondly, a special thanks to Rami. He left Beirut yesterday and came here. He's going back in about 6 hours. And we deeply appreciate him coming and speaking to us. One cute little story. 1978, I think Rami was the editor of the Jordan Times. And I think the number 2 in Jordanian intelligence was murdered. And on page 3 of the Jordan Times that next day, there was an obituary for the deputy head of intelligence on one side, and then a story about the new orangutan that had come to the Jordanian zoo. The problem was the pictures were reversed. And Rami got into a hell of a lot of trouble with authorities. I have that story on pretty good say-so from some others. The third thing I want to say is that in 6 short weeks, Haleh Esfandiari is going to step down as the director of the Middle East program and become a scholar at the center. And she has provided over the last more than 15 years extraordinary leadership for the Middle East program, and I hope you will just join me in thanking her for the incredible commitment she has made to the center. We're deeply appreciative.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. This was not part of the script. Thank you very much, Rami. Thank you. Let's go.